The morning we buried my wife, the ground was frozen solid. That's something people don't think about when they imagine funerals in January in Ontario. The ground doesn't give easily. It resists, like it doesn't want to accept what you're putting into it. I stood there at the graveside in Beechwood Cemetery, my son Martin on my left, my daughter-in-law Claire on my right, and I remember thinking Margaret would have hated this cold. She always said Canadian winters were God's way of testing whether you really wanted to stay. She stayed for 61 years. She stayed for me, for our son, for the grandchildren she spoiled rotten every Sunday with butter tarts, and that terrible decaf she pretended was the real thing. And now the ground was swallowing her up, and I had nowhere to put my hands. Martin drove me home afterward. He was quiet the whole way, which I appreciated. My son has always been better at silence than words, the opposite of his mother. Claire sat in the back and said all the things people say. She's at peace now, Walter, and she wouldn't want you to be sad. And you know you can always call us. I nodded at all of it. I didn't believe any of it. Not because Claire was lying. She wasn't. She's always been a decent enough woman. I just couldn't hear anything properly that day. Everything was arriving from very far away, like a radio signal from another province. They dropped me off at the house on Elmridge Drive at 2:30. Martin hugged me at the door, one of those stiff, back-patting hugs men give each other when they don't know what else to do. Claire kissed my cheek. They said they'd call in the morning. I watched their Lexus back out of the driveway, and I stood there in the doorway for a long moment before I went inside. The house had that smell. That particular silence that settles when someone who used to fill a space is suddenly gone from it. Margaret's cardigan was still on the hook by the door. Her reading glasses were on the kitchen table, folded next to the novel she'd been working through. A library book. It was overdue. I remember thinking I needed to call the branch and explain. I put on the kettle. I didn't want tea. I just needed something to do with my hands. It was 20 minutes past 3 when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. A 613 area code, but not one I knew. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was 64 years old, and I had just buried my wife of 38 years, and I was not in any condition to talk to anyone. But something made me pick up. I don't know what. Margaret used to say I never could leave a ringing phone alone. Mr. Pearce? A woman's voice. Controlled, careful. The kind of voice that's choosing every word. Speaking, I said. My name is Diane Holloway. I work at Northfield Partners, in their legal department. I was Margaret's colleague for 11 years. A pause. I'm very sorry for your loss. She was a remarkable woman. Thank you, I said. The automatic response. Were you at the service? I'm afraid I didn't. I wasn't. Another pause. Longer this time. Mr. Pearce, I need to speak with you. Not on the phone. I know the timing is terrible. I know what day this is. But I need you to understand that I'm calling you now, today, because I don't know how much longer I can. I need to do this while I still have the nerve. I set down my mug. What's this about, Miss Holloway? Something I found, she said. Something I think you need to see. Something about Margaret. She told me to come to a coffee shop on Bank Street the following morning. She told me not to mention the meeting to anyone. And then she said something that I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. Mr. Pearce, I want you to know that I loved Margaret like a sister. What I'm about to show you, I'm not doing it to hurt you. I'm doing it because she would have wanted you to know the truth, even if the truth is hard. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in our bed on my side. I still kept to my side, force of habit after all those years, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about that word, truth. Diane Holloway was already at the coffee shop when I arrived, sitting in the back corner with her hands wrapped around a mug and a manila envelope on the table in front of her. She was in her mid-50s, I guessed. Sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses. She looked like someone who had not slept either. She thanked me for coming. She apologized again for the timing. And then, without much preamble, she slid the envelope across the table toward me. Before you open that, she said, I need to tell you something. About 18 months ago, Northfield Partners brought in a new managing director. His name is Richard Caulfield. He came from a firm in Calgary, and he came with very big plans. I nodded, not sure where this was going. Margaret had worked at Northfield for 14 years. Estate law, mostly. She'd been a senior paralegal, excellent at her job, the kind of person who knew where everything was and how everything worked. She'd talked about retiring in another year or two. Caulfield restructured everything, Diane continued. including how the firm handled client accounts during estate settlement. He moved a lot of the discretionary authority away from the senior lawyers and toward the managing director's office, meaning toward himself. She paused. Margaret noticed discrepancies in the account reconciliations about 8 months ago. Small ones at first, amounts that could be explained as administrative errors. But they weren't errors, I said. No, they were not. She nodded at the envelope. She documented everything. Every discrepancy she found cross-referenced with the original client files, going back almost 2 years. She was very thorough. She always was. I opened the envelope. It took me a long time to understand what I was looking at. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a retired civil engineer. But Margaret had organized everything with the kind of clarity that made it possible for anyone to follow. There were spreadsheets, printed and annotated in her handwriting, that careful, looping cursive I knew as well as I knew my own name. There were copies of bank statements, internal transfer records, client account summaries, and alongside each one, in red pen, her notes. This should be $47,000. Received by estate, $31,200. Difference unaccounted for. Client deceased. No family to query. Funds not traceable to any expense record. Third instance in this client file. Pattern confirmed. I sat there in that coffee shop reading my dead wife's handwriting, and I felt the world tilt under me. How much? I finally asked. Diane wrapped her hands tighter around her mug. Based on what Margaret was able to document, and she believed she'd only found a portion of it, just over $2 million, taken from deceased clients' estates over approximately 22 months. $2 million, stolen from the estates of dead people, people who had no one left to notice. Why didn't she go to the police? I asked. Or the Law Society? Diane was quiet for a moment. She tried. 3 months ago, she put together a formal complaint to the Law Society of Ontario. She told me she was going to submit it the following week. She looked down at her mug. That same week, she was diagnosed. The cancer they'd thought was in remission had come back. And it was fast, I said. The word came out flat. It was very fast. Yes, I understood then what Diane was not quite saying. Margaret had spent her last months building a case, gathering evidence, annotating files, creating a record that could be followed by someone who didn't know what she knew. And then she had gotten sick again, too quickly, and there had been no time. She had put the evidence in an envelope and given it to the one person at the firm she trusted. And now Diane Holloway was sitting across from me in a coffee shop on Bank Street because she was afraid of what she was holding, and she needed someone else to carry it. Why are you frightened? I asked, specifically. She looked at me steadily. Because last month, a colleague of mine, a junior associate named Ben Tremblay, who Margaret had also confided in, was abruptly let go. And 2 weeks after that, he was in a minor car accident, nothing serious. But his brakes had been interfered with. She paused. The police said they couldn't confirm it was deliberate. I drove home from that coffee shop a different man than the one who had driven there. The grief was still there. It didn't go anywhere. But something had settled over it, or maybe under it something firm and cold and purposeful. For the first time since the diagnosis, since the slow, terrible decline, since the morning I had held Margaret's hand in the palliative care room and felt the moment her grip went loose for the first time, I had something to do. I went into Margaret's home office. She had always kept it neat. Her desk faced the window that looked onto the backyard, the one where she could see the bird feeder she'd put up years ago. On the desk, her laptop, her day planner, a small framed photograph of the two of us at Martin's wedding. In the file cabinet by the left wall. 14 years of organized folders. I started reading. It took me 3 days. She had been thorough in a way that went beyond thorough. She had anticipated objections. She had created a second set of notes that walked through each piece of evidence and explained, in plain language, exactly what it meant. It was not just documentation. It was an argument. She had built a case that a jury could understand without a law degree. She had also, tucked into the back of the final folder, written me a letter. I won't share all of it. Some things are private. But she wrote that she hadn't told me because she hadn't wanted to frighten me while things were still uncertain. She wrote that if I was reading this, then something had prevented her from finishing it herself. She wrote that she trusted me to know what to do, or to find someone who did. She wrote, "You always were the stubborn one, Walter. Use it." I sat at her desk with that letter in my hands for a very long time. Then I called my brother-in-law. Helen's husband, Douglas Firth, had retired 3 years earlier from a 30-year career with the Ontario Securities Commission. He knew regulation, he knew financial fraud, and more importantly, he knew exactly who to call. I hadn't told Martin yet. I knew my son. Martin was a good man, but he was also the kind of man who worried out loud and wanted to involve lawyers immediately and would have been on the phone to 3 different people before I'd finished explaining the situation. I needed to move carefully. Whatever Caulfield had been willing to do to bend Tremblay's brakes, I wasn't prepared to take unnecessary risks. Douglas came to the house the next evening. He sat at the kitchen table and went through everything. He asked careful, quiet questions. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and cleaned them, which he always did when he was thinking hard. "This is significant, Walter," he said. "This is if everything she documented holds up. This is serious criminal fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. Theft over 5,000. Potentially money laundering depending on where the funds went." He put his glasses back on. She was right to go to the Law Society. But honestly, given the scale, the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit is the right next step. "Can we do that without tipping Caulfield off?" I asked. "If we're careful, yes." He paused. "There's something else you should know. Northfield Partners has a major client gala scheduled for next month, their annual appreciation event. They do it every February, at that hotel on Rideau the Chateau something. Several hundred guests. Clients, lawyers, city people. Caulfield hosts it personally. It's a big visibility event for him." I looked at Douglas. He looked at me. "Margaret liked to say," I told him, "that the best time to catch a man with his hand in the till is when he thinks everyone is watching the entertainment." Douglas allowed himself a small smile. She was a smart woman, the smartest person I ever knew. What followed was 5 weeks of the most focused work I had done since I was 40 years old and building aqueduct systems for the region of Waterloo. Douglas contacted the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit through a former colleague. They were, as it turned out, already aware of Caulfield's name in connection with a separate complaint from 2 years prior that had never gathered sufficient evidence. What Margaret had built was exactly what they needed. They assigned a detective, a patient, methodical woman named Sergeant Beaumont, who reminded me slightly of my wife in the way she asked questions and then went very quiet while you answered them. Diane Holloway agreed to cooperate. She had been more frightened than she'd let on. She told Sergeant Beaumont that she had made 3 attempts to report concerns internally and had been dismissed each time by senior partners who were either complicit or willfully blind. Sergeant Beaumont explained the plan for the gala. Caulfield had been under surveillance for 3 weeks by then. He had a second phone. He had a storage account. He had a man named Perry who handled the movement of funds through a numbered company registered in Alberta. What the investigators needed was a recorded admission, something that could not be argued away as circumstantial documentation, however thorough. They needed him to say it. The gala was on a Thursday. Martin drove me there. I had told him I was going to represent Margaret. She had attended this event every year, and several of her longtime clients would be there. He thought I was being brave about grief. He wasn't wrong, exactly. I wore the suit I had worn to Margaret's retirement celebration, the one she'd picked out for me at a shop in the Glebe. I put on the tie she'd bought me for our 35th anniversary. I thought about her getting dressed in the mornings. I thought about the bird feeder outside her office window. Then I walked into the Chateau Laurier ballroom with 340 other guests, and I found Richard Caulfield near the bar. He was exactly what I'd expected from the file photos. Tall, silver-templed, the kind of confident that gets mistaken for competence at cocktail parties. He expressed his condolences about Margaret with precisely the right amount of warmth. He said she had been invaluable to the firm. He said she would be greatly missed. I thanked him. I told him I was going through her files, trying to settle some of her unfinished business. I said I'd found some account records I didn't fully understand and wondered if he might be able to clarify a few things. Nothing alarming, just the numbers on a couple of estate files didn't quite match what I was seeing in the bank summaries. Probably nothing. But I was an engineer, I said. I liked things to add up. Something moved behind his eyes. Very briefly, like a window being shuttered. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Estate accounting can be complicated. Why don't we find somewhere a bit quieter?" He led me to a small anteroom off the main hall. A sitting room, really a couple of chairs, a side table, a door that closed. He was smiling, the kind of smile that doesn't know it's already over. What happened in that room I have since heard on recording, in Sergeant Beaumont's office, sitting with Douglas and 2 officers and Diane Holloway. I told Caulfield exactly which files I was looking at. I named the clients elderly people, long deceased, their estates supposed to have passed to hospitals and charities and distant relatives who would never think to audit the final accounting. I watched his smile calibrate, second by second, as he decided how to handle me. He tested a few explanations, reasonable-sounding ones. I nodded along and asked quiet follow-up questions, the way Margaret's notes had taught me to. And then I told him that I had found the second ledger. There was no second ledger, but Margaret had referenced the secondary reconciliation file in her notes in a way that Caulfield, if he was guilty, would know exactly what that meant. His face changed. He stopped performing, and then, because he thought he was alone with a grieving 64-year-old widower in a closed room at a party he controlled, he made the mistake of telling me what he thought he needed to tell me, about how certain irregularities needed to stay in-house, about the complex fee arrangements that weren't reflected in standard documentation, about what it would mean for me, for both of us, to let certain things remain unexamined. He was not quite confessing. He was negotiating, but it amounted to the same thing. Sergeant Beaumont told me afterward that what I'd given them was more than enough. They arrested Richard Caulfield 2 weeks later at his home in Rockcliffe Park, early morning. He was charged with fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and theft 23 counts in total, representing 23 client estates. Perry, the Alberta connection, was picked up the same day. 2 senior partners at Northfield who had signed off on account reconciliations without reviewing them were under separate investigation. The Law Society of Ontario opened its own proceeding. I went to see Diane Holloway when the charges were announced. We had coffee at the same shop on Bank Street. She looked like someone who had set down something very heavy. She would have been relieved, Diane said. She would have been annoyed she didn't get to see it herself, I said. Diane laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that catches you off guard. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. I have driven out to Beechwood 3 times since the funeral. I bring her the bird feeder. Not literally, I bring the bird feeder seeds, the kind she always kept in the garage. I know it doesn't make any sense. I know she can't see it. But I talked to her out there, in the cold, because she was always the one I talked things through with, and I am not ready to stop. I told her how it went. All of it. The coffee shop, the files, Douglas, Sergeant Beaumont, the gala, the look on Caulfield's face when he realized. I told her she had built something that outlasted her, that her work had protected those families, those estates, those strangers who would never know her name. The last time I went, the temperature was coming up. March. And you could almost believe winter was thinking about loosening its grip. I stood at her headstone and I thought about what she had written in that letter, that she trusted me to know what to do, that I was the stubborn one. I put my hand on the cold stone. You did the hard part, I said. I just finished it. I don't know if there is anything after this. Margaret believed there was, quietly and without making a fuss about it, the way she believed in most things. I am less certain, but I know that she spent the last months of her life, months when she had every reason to rest, every reason to let go, building something careful and true and just. Not for herself. For people she had never met, whose only connection to her was that their names appeared in files she was responsible for. That is who she was. And if I can carry that forward, if I can be half as deliberate and half as decent in the years I have left, then I will consider myself a fortunate man. The kettle at home still boils. I still put on tea. I don't always drink. The library finally waived the late fee on her book when I explained. I kept the cardigan on the hook by the door.